Picture this. You wake up one morning to find bulldozers tearing through your backyard, not next to your property, not near your fence line, but directly on land that's been in your family for 3 generations. The construction crew tells you they have permits. The HOA president assures you everything is legal. The city planning office shows you official documents with signatures and stamps. But here's the thing. None of them bothered to check one crucial detail that would cost them everything. Margaret Chen had been watching this exact scenario unfold for months from her kitchen window. What started as a few survey stakes in the spring had become a full-scale residential development by fall. 300 homes, complete with sidewalks, streetlights, and perfectly manicured lawns, all built on what she knew to be her property. While everyone around her celebrated the new Willowbrook Commons development and the increased property values it would bring, Margaret was quietly preparing something that would shake this affluent suburb to its core. You see, Margaret wasn't just any property owner. She was a retired land surveyor with 40 years of experience, a woman who understood property lines better than most attorneys, and someone who had learned patience from watching her grandmother fight similar battles decades earlier. When the Willowbrook Estates HOA decided to expand their territory, they picked the wrong person to cross. What Margaret did next wasn't just revenge. It was a masterclass in legal strategy that would become legendary in property law circles and cost the HOA more than they ever imagined possible. Margaret Chen's story begins in 1952 when her grandfather, James Liu, purchased 47 acres of rolling farmland on the outskirts of what would eventually become the city of Millbrook. At the time, the area was considered too far from downtown to be valuable, but James had vision. He paid cash, $8,000 that represented his entire life savings, for land that real estate agents dismissed as worthless scrub brush and rocky soil. James was an immigrant from Taiwan who understood something that the local developers didn't. Infrastructure would eventually catch up to available land, and when it did, location would matter more than current convenience. He built a modest farmhouse on the highest hill of the property, giving him a clear view of the surrounding countryside. From his front porch, he could see for miles in every direction, something that would prove crucial decades later. When Margaret's father inherited the property in 1981, suburban sprawl was just beginning to creep toward their family land. Housing developments with names like Meadowbrook and Pine Valley started appearing on formerly rural roads. Property taxes began climbing as the area was rezoned from agricultural to residential. But the Chen family held on, watching their quiet farmland transform into one of the most desirable zip codes in the county. Margaret herself had grown up exploring every corner of those 47 acres. She knew where the old property markers were buried, could identify the exact spots where the boundary lines ran, and had walked the perimeter so many times she could navigate it blindfolded. When she decided to become a land surveyor, it wasn't by accident. She wanted to understand the technical and legal aspects of the thing her family valued most. After college, Margaret worked for the county surveyor's office, then later started her own consulting firm. She spent 40 years measuring property lines, resolving boundary disputes, and helping families understand exactly what they owned. She had seen every trick in the book: developers who tried to claim adverse possession, neighbors who moved fence lines a few inches each year, and city planners who made clerical errors that always seemed to benefit major construction projects. In 2019, Margaret retired and moved back to the family property to take care of her aging parents. The area had completely transformed. What once were cornfields and pastures had become the exclusive Willowbrook Estates community, home to tech executives, successful attorneys, and other affluent professionals. The median home price had jumped to $1.2 million, and the HOA fees alone cost more per month than most people's rent. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was exactly what you'd expect from a community where the average household income topped $200,000. They had rules about everything: what color you could paint your mailbox, how tall your grass could grow, which types of flowers were acceptable in front yard gardens, and even restrictions on when Christmas decorations could be displayed. The HOA board was led by Preston Whitmore III, a corporate attorney who treated neighborhood management like a personal kingdom. Preston had moved to Willowbrook Estates 5 years earlier when his law firm made him a partner. He immediately joined the HOA board and within 2 years had maneuvered himself into the president position. Preston was the kind of person who genuinely believed that property values were more important than property rights, and that a well-regulated community was worth any amount of individual sacrifice. The Chen family property sat right in the middle of what Preston considered to be prime development real estate. From his perspective, it was an eyesore, a run-down farmhouse and overgrown fields that brought down the aesthetic appeal of the entire neighborhood. He had tried multiple times to approach Margaret's parents about selling, offering what he considered to be generous amounts. Each time he was politely but firmly refused. What Preston didn't realize was that the Chen property wasn't just 47 acres of undeveloped land. Due to a surveying error made during the original development of Willowbrook Estates in 1987, a significant portion of what everyone believed to be HOA common area was actually still owned by the Chen family. The mistake had been buried in paperwork, overlooked during multiple property transfers, and never caught by any of the title companies involved in the development process. Margaret had discovered this discrepancy shortly after moving back home, during a routine review of her family's property documents. As a professional surveyor, she immediately recognized what had happened and understood the implications. But rather than immediately confronting the HOA or demanding corrections, she decided to wait and watch. Sometimes, she knew from experience, patience could be more powerful than immediate action. The opportunity she was waiting for came in early 2023 when the Willowbrook Estates HOA announced their plans for Phase 2 development. They had purchased what they believed to be an additional 60 acres of adjacent land and planned to build 300 new luxury homes. The expansion would nearly double the size of the community and provide the HOA with millions in additional revenue from new membership fees. Preston Whitmore was particularly excited about this expansion because it would cement his legacy as the HOA president who transformed Willowbrook Estates into one of the premier planned communities in the region. He had already been featured in a local business magazine article about visionary community leadership and was considering a run for city council based on his HOA success. The first signs of trouble should have been obvious to anyone paying attention, but Preston Whitmore and the Willowbrook Estates HOA board were too caught up in their grand expansion plans to notice the warning signs. When the surveying crew arrived in March 2023 to begin preliminary work on the Phase 2 development, they encountered something unexpected: existing survey markers that didn't match their development plans. Professional surveyors know that existing markers take precedence over newer maps, but the crew Preston hired was more focused on speed than accuracy. They were working under a tight deadline and substantial financial pressure to begin construction quickly. Rather than stopping to investigate the discrepancy, they simply assumed the old markers were incorrect and proceeded with their original survey plan. Margaret watched all of this unfold from her kitchen window with a mixture of fascination and growing anticipation. Each morning, she would drink her coffee and observe the survey crew making what she knew were critical errors. She could have walked outside and corrected them at any time. In fact, professional ethics probably suggested she should have. But Margaret had learned something important during her 4 decades in the surveying business. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to let the other party fully commit to their mistake first. By May, the survey work was complete and construction permits had been approved by the city planning office. The HOA had invested nearly $200,000 in preliminary work, architectural plans, and legal fees. Preston Whitmore was so confident in the project that he had already begun advertising the new Phase 2 homes to potential buyers, promising them exclusive access to expanded common areas and premium amenities. The groundbreaking ceremony for Willowbrook Commons, the official name chosen for the Phase 2 development, was scheduled for June 15th. Preston had invited the mayor, several city council members, and local business leaders. The event was covered by the regional newspaper and featured on the evening news. In his speech, Preston talked about responsible growth, community values, and the importance of maintaining Willowbrook Estates' reputation as a premier residential destination. What Preston didn't mention was that in the weeks leading up to groundbreaking, the HOA had received several concerned calls from residents who lived near the Chen property. These neighbors had noticed that some of the survey work appeared to be taking place closer to the old farmhouse than the original development plans had indicated. When they raised these concerns with the HOA board, they were assured that everything had been properly surveyed and legally approved. Margaret had been receiving some of these calls as well. Longtime neighbors who had known her family for years were worried that the new development might impact the Chen property. They offered to help her contact an attorney or file complaints with the city planning office. Margaret thanked them for their concern, but assured them she was handling the situation in her own way. The reality was that Margaret had been handling the situation from the very beginning, but not in the way anyone expected. Rather than reacting to the HOA's expansion plans, she had been proactively preparing for this exact scenario. During the months of surveying and planning, Margaret had been conducting her own careful research, documenting everything from permit applications to construction crew schedules. She had also been in quiet communication with several property law specialists, not because she needed legal advice, but because she wanted to ensure that when the time came to act, every detail would be handled perfectly. Margaret understood that in property disputes, being right wasn't enough. You had to be able to prove you were right in a way that would hold up under legal scrutiny. Construction on the Willowbrook Commons development began in earnest during July. The first phase involved clearing trees, grading land, and installing basic infrastructure. From Margaret's perspective, watching this process was both fascinating and increasingly surreal. She could see construction crews working on what she knew to be her family's property, installing utilities and foundations for homes that would never legally belong to the people who would eventually purchase them. The HOA's construction timeline was aggressive, driven by Preston's desire to have model homes ready for viewing by the end of the year. Multiple construction crews worked simultaneously on different sections of the development. By September, the basic infrastructure was in place and foundation work had begun on the first 30 homes. It was during this phase that Margaret made her first direct contact with the HOA since the expansion project had begun. She sent a certified letter to Preston Whitmore, requesting a meeting to discuss property boundary concerns related to the Phase 2 development. The letter was professionally worded and gave no indication of the scope of the problem the HOA was about to face. Preston's response was exactly what Margaret had expected. He scheduled a brief meeting for the following week, clearly intending to offer Margaret some minor concession or financial compensation to address what he assumed were easily resolved boundary issues. From Preston's perspective, Margaret was probably concerned about noise, dust, or some other temporary inconvenience related to nearby construction. The meeting took place on a Tuesday afternoon in the HOA's Community Center conference room. Preston arrived with 2 other board members and a legal pad full of notes about potential compromises they could offer. Margaret arrived with a leather portfolio containing 40 years of surveying expertise and documentation that would change everything. For the first few minutes, the conversation proceeded exactly as Preston had planned. He expressed understanding about Margaret's concerns, acknowledged that major construction projects could be disruptive to neighboring properties, and began outlining several ways the HOA could minimize the impact on her family's land. He talked about noise restrictions, dust control measures, and even offered to pay for professional landscaping to screen her property from the new development. Margaret listened politely to Preston's entire presentation before opening her portfolio. She then calmly explained that the HOA's Phase 2 development wasn't being built near her property. It was being built on her property. Specifically, she informed Preston that due to a surveying error made during the original Willowbrook Estates development, approximately 37 acres of what the HOA believed to be their expansion land was actually still owned by the Chen family. The room went completely silent. Preston stared at Margaret as if she had spoken in a foreign language. One of the other board members asked her to repeat what she had just said. Margaret did so, this time adding that she had professional survey documentation, original property deeds, and legal verification of her family's ownership of the land in question. Preston's first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by anger. He informed Margaret that the HOA had spent months working with professional surveyors, title companies, and legal experts to ensure that all property boundaries were properly established. He suggested that Margaret was either mistaken or attempting some kind of scam to extract money from the HOA. Margaret's response was to begin systematically presenting her documentation. She showed them the original 1952 property deed for her grandfather's land purchase. She presented the 1987 survey maps from the original Willowbrook Estates development, highlighting the discrepancies between what was actually surveyed and what was recorded. She provided recent professional surveys that confirmed her family's continued ownership of the disputed land. By the end of the meeting, Preston's confidence had transformed into barely controlled panic. If Margaret was correct, and her documentation certainly suggested she was, the HOA had just spent hundreds of thousands of dollars building the early phases of a development on land they didn't own. Worse, they had already sold construction contracts for homes they couldn't legally build. Preston's final statement in that meeting would later become famous in local legal circles. He told Margaret that the HOA would look into her claims, but that she shouldn't expect them to simply abandon a multi-million-dollar development project based on what he called old paperwork and technicalities. He suggested that if Margaret really believed she owned the land, she should take the matter to court like any other property dispute. Margaret smiled and thanked Preston for his suggestion. She told him she would certainly consider all of her legal options. What she didn't tell him was that she had already been considering those options for months, and that Preston had just made the one statement that would make her next actions not just legally justified, but personally satisfying. Margaret Chen's response to Preston Whitmore's challenge came exactly 72 hours later, delivered at 8:47 a.m. on a Friday morning when the Willowbrook Commons construction site was at its busiest. But it wasn't delivered to Preston, or to the HOA board, or even to their legal representatives. Instead, Margaret's response arrived in the form of a county sheriff's deputy serving a court-ordered injunction that immediately halted all construction activity on the disputed property. The legal document was comprehensive and devastating. Margaret had not just filed a simple property dispute claim. She had initiated what property lawyers call a quiet title action, a legal process that requires a court to definitively determine who owns contested land. But more importantly, she had requested and received a temporary restraining order that prohibited any further construction, alteration, or development of the property until ownership could be legally established. The scene at the construction site that morning was surreal. Workers who had arrived expecting a normal day of foundation work instead found themselves watching the sheriff's deputy post legal notices on every piece of construction equipment. The lead contractor tried calling Preston Whitmore for guidance, but Preston was in an emergency meeting with the HOA's legal team trying to understand how Margaret had managed to obtain a court order so quickly. What Preston didn't realize was that Margaret's legal strategy had been months in the making. While the HOA had been focused on construction schedules and sales projections, Margaret had been methodically building an airtight legal case with the help of one of the region's most respected property law firms. She hadn't just documented her family's ownership of the land, she had anticipated every possible challenge the HOA might raise and prepared responses in advance. The temporary restraining order was just the beginning. Margaret's legal team had also filed a formal complaint alleging trespass, property damage, and what lawyers call conversion, essentially claiming that the HOA had stolen her property by building on it without permission. Each of these claims carried not just the possibility of recovering damages, but also the potential for punitive damages if the court determined that the HOA's actions were willfully negligent. Preston's first instinct was to fight back aggressively. He contacted the HOA's insurance company, assuming that their liability coverage would handle what he still believed was a frivolous lawsuit. But the insurance representative delivered bad news. Property disputes involving construction on contested land were specifically excluded from their standard coverage. If Margaret's claims were valid, the HOA would be responsible for all damages and legal costs personally. The financial implications began to sink in over the next several days, as Preston and the HOA board received estimates from their legal team. Fighting Margaret's quiet title action would cost a minimum of $50,000 in legal fees with no guarantee of success. If they lost the case, they would be responsible for not only removing all construction from Margaret's property, but also for compensating her for the damage caused by months of building activity. But the immediate financial costs were nothing compared to the broader implications of Margaret's legal strategy. The temporary restraining order had effectively frozen the entire Phase 2 development project. Even construction on land that clearly belonged to the HOA couldn't continue because the project's utilities, roads, and basic infrastructure were all connected to areas now under legal dispute. More devastating still was the impact on the HOA's pre-sale contracts. Nearly 40 families had put down deposits and signed purchase agreements for homes in the Willowbrook Commons development. These contracts included specific delivery dates and penalties for delays. If the HOA couldn't complete construction on schedule, they would owe substantial financial compensation to every prospective buyer. Preston tried to manage the crisis by controlling information flow. He sent a carefully worded letter to HOA members explaining that there had been a temporary delay in the Phase 2 development due to permit clarifications with the county. He assured residents that the issue would be resolved quickly and that construction would resume shortly. But Margaret's legal team had anticipated this response as well. On the same day that Preston's letter was delivered to Willowbrook Estates residents, Margaret's attorneys filed additional court documents that made the full scope of the property dispute a matter of public record. Local news outlets picked up the story within hours, and by evening, Preston was fielding calls from reporters who wanted to know how the HOA had managed to begin construction on land they didn't own. The media coverage was brutal for Preston and the HOA board. The regional newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "HOA Builds Homes on Wrong Property," accompanied by photographs of the halted construction site and interviews with confused prospective buyers. The article highlighted the fact that the HOA had ignored existing survey markers and proceeded with construction, despite having received concerns from residents about property boundaries. Television news coverage was even more damaging. The evening news featured aerial footage of the construction site, clearly showing the proximity of the building activity to Margaret's farmhouse. The reporter interviewed Margaret on her front porch, where she calmly explained that she had been trying to resolve the issue privately with the HOA, but had been forced to take legal action when they refused to acknowledge her family's property rights. The contrast between Margaret's composed, reasonable demeanor and Preston's increasingly frantic attempts at damage control was stark. When reporters contacted Preston for comment, his responses were defensive and often contradictory. He alternated between claiming that the HOA had done nothing wrong and suggesting that Margaret was trying to exploit a technical loophole for financial gain. But the most damaging revelation came when investigative reporters began examining the public records related to the original Willowbrook Estates development. They discovered that the 1987 surveying error that had created the current dispute wasn't a simple mistake. It was part of a pattern of sloppy record-keeping and corner-cutting that had characterized several major developments in the area during the 1980s. More importantly, the reporters found evidence that similar property boundary issues existed throughout Willowbrook Estates. The same surveying company that had made the error on Margaret's property had also made mistakes on several other boundary lines within the community. While these errors hadn't resulted in construction on disputed land, they had created legal uncertainties that could affect property values and title insurance for dozens of current residents. Preston's response to this media scrutiny was to hire a public relations firm and attempt to shift the narrative. He gave interviews claiming that Margaret was an opportunistic property speculator who was trying to halt legitimate development for personal profit. He suggested that her quiet title action was really an attempt to force the HOA to purchase her land at an inflated price. This strategy backfired spectacularly when Margaret's legal team released additional documentation showing that the HOA had been repeatedly warned about potential property boundary issues but had chosen to proceed with construction anyway. Email communications between Preston and the HOA's surveying contractor showed that concerns about existing property markers had been dismissed as probably irrelevant and not worth delaying the project. The revelation that Preston had been aware of potential boundary issues but had decided to proceed with construction anyway transformed the legal case from a simple property dispute into something much more serious. Margaret's attorneys amended their complaint to include allegations of willful trespass and intentional property damage, claims that carried the possibility of treble damages under state law. By this point, Preston was facing pressure not just from Margaret's legal case but from within the Willowbrook Estates community itself. HOA members who had initially supported the Phase 2 development were now worried about potential liability for the board's decisions. Several residents began demanding Preston's resignation, and some were threatening to file their own lawsuits against the HOA board for mismanagement. The final blow to Preston's position came when Margaret's legal team filed a motion requesting that the court appoint an independent surveyor to definitively establish the property boundaries. This motion included a detailed proposal for resolving the dispute that would allow construction to resume on land that legitimately belonged to the HOA, while ensuring that Margaret received full compensation for the damage to her property. Preston's legal team advised him that Margaret's proposed resolution was actually quite reasonable and that continuing to fight the case would likely result in a much worse outcome for the HOA. But Preston had become so invested in the battle that he couldn't accept what he saw as surrender to someone he considered an opportunistic troublemaker. His refusal to consider settlement negotiations prompted several HOA board members to privately contact Margaret's attorneys about resolving the dispute without Preston's involvement. These board members were concerned that Preston's ego and stubbornness were putting the entire community at financial risk. The resolution of Margaret Chen's property dispute with the Willowbrook Estates HOA came not through a dramatic courtroom confrontation, but through a series of private negotiations that ultimately removed Preston Whitmore from the equation entirely. 3 months after Margaret filed her quiet title action, a majority of the HOA board voted to accept her settlement proposal and simultaneously voted to remove Preston as president for failure to exercise reasonable judgment in property management decisions. The settlement agreement was comprehensive and precedent-setting. Margaret agreed to sell the HOA the specific parcels of her land where construction had already begun, but at a price that reflected both the current market value and substantial compensation for the trespass and property damage. The final purchase price was $2.7 million, nearly 3 times what Preston had originally offered the Chen family for their entire property. More significantly, the settlement required the HOA to acknowledge in writing that they had built on Margaret's land without permission and to implement new procedures for all future development projects. These procedures included mandatory independent surveys for any construction activity, legal review of all property boundary issues, and community notification requirements that would prevent similar disputes from occurring. The financial impact on the Willowbrook Estates HOA was substantial, but not catastrophic. The $2.7 million land purchase, combined with legal fees and construction delays, added nearly $4 million to the cost of the Phase 2 development. This expense was ultimately passed on to prospective buyers through higher home prices, but the development remained economically viable. For Margaret personally, the settlement represented vindication not just for her family's property rights, but for the patient, methodical approach she had taken to resolving the dispute. Rather than immediately confronting the HOA when she first discovered their surveying error, she had waited until they were fully committed to their mistake, making it impossible for them to walk away without significant consequences. The $2.7 million settlement payment allowed Margaret to pay off the remaining mortgage on her family's property and establish a trust fund that would ensure the land remained in the Chen family for future generations. She used a portion of the money to restore the farmhouse where she had grown up and to implement conservation measures that would protect the remaining 10 acres from future development pressure. But perhaps more importantly, Margaret's victory established legal precedents that would benefit property owners throughout the region. Her case became a textbook example of how patient documentation and strategic legal action could succeed against well-funded opponents who assumed that individual property owners wouldn't have the resources or expertise to fight back effectively. Preston Whitmore's fall from community leadership was swift and complete. After being removed as HOA president, he found himself facing personal liability for several of the decisions he had made during the dispute. His homeowner's insurance didn't cover his actions as an HOA board member, and he was forced to hire his own legal representation to defend against potential lawsuits from community members who claimed his mismanagement had damaged their property values. The professional consequences for Preston extended beyond the immediate legal costs. His law firm, concerned about the negative publicity associated with his HOA leadership, quietly encouraged him to take a leave of absence while the dust settled. When local media coverage of the property dispute continued for several months, Preston ultimately resigned from the firm and moved to another state to rebuild his career. The surveying company that had made the original error in 1987 and then compounded it by ignoring existing property markers during the Phase 2 development faced their own significant consequences. Margaret's case prompted a review of their work on other major developments, revealing a pattern of shortcuts and inadequate documentation that resulted in the loss of their professional licensing and several additional lawsuits. For the broader Willowbrook Estates community, Margaret's victory initially created anxiety about potential property value impacts and legal uncertainties. But over time, residents came to appreciate that the new procedures implemented as part of the settlement actually provided greater security and transparency for all property owners in the development. The case also prompted changes in county-level property development procedures. Local officials, embarrassed by the media coverage of how easily the HOA had obtained construction permits for disputed land, implemented new requirements for independent boundary verification before major development projects could receive approval. Margaret's story became legendary in property law circles and was featured in several legal journals as an example of effective quiet title litigation. But beyond the legal community, her case resonated with anyone who had ever felt powerless against institutional authority or bureaucratic indifference. The key lesson from Margaret's experience wasn't just about property rights or legal strategy. It was about the power of patience, preparation, and professional expertise. While Preston Whitmore had relied on his authority as HOA president and his assumption that individual property owners wouldn't challenge institutional decisions, Margaret had relied on careful documentation, strategic thinking, and deep knowledge of the legal and technical issues involved. Margaret's approach also demonstrated the importance of choosing your battles wisely. Rather than immediately fighting every small encroachment or minor dispute, she had waited for a situation where the stakes were high enough to justify comprehensive legal action and where her opponents were so committed to their position that backing down would be costly and embarrassing. Perhaps most importantly, Margaret's story illustrated that David versus Goliath victories are possible when David has better information, better preparation, and better timing than Goliath expects. The HOA board had assumed that their professional resources, legal connections, and financial advantages would make them invulnerable to challenges from individual property owners. They discovered too late that expertise and patience could be more powerful than authority and money. Today, the Willowbrook Commons development has been completed successfully, with the remaining homes selling at premium prices despite the earlier controversy. The community has actually benefited from the enhanced property boundary procedures that resulted from Margaret's lawsuit, giving all residents greater confidence in their property rights and development processes. Margaret continues to live on her family's farmland, now secure in the knowledge that future generations of the Chen family will be able to enjoy the same property rights that her grandfather established with his $8,000 investment in 1952. The 10 acres she chose to keep provide a peaceful buffer between her home and the surrounding suburban development, a reminder that sometimes the best response to unwanted change is patient resistance rather than immediate confrontation. The question that Margaret's story leaves us with isn't whether individual property owners can successfully challenge institutional authority. Her case proves that they can. The real question is whether most people have the patience, expertise, and strategic thinking to recognize when the time is right to act, and whether they're willing to invest the time and energy required to do it properly. In a world where quick fixes and immediate gratification often seem more appealing than careful planning and strategic patience, Margaret Chen's approach offers a different model. Sometimes the most powerful action you can take is to wait until your opponents have committed themselves so completely to their mistake that victory becomes inevitable. Sometimes the best trap is the one your enemies build for themselves.